What is the Flint water crisis? Simply put, the Flint water crisis is an instance of bad decision making and environmental injustice that led to about 100,000 citizens being exposed to lead via their drinking water. It occurred between April 2014 and April 2018 in the city of Flint, Michigan, which is approximately 70 miles northwest of Detroit. During the exposure period, affected residents had discolored and foul smelling water with high lead contents, routinely above the federal action level. The contaminated water caused developmental delays in children, cognitive impairments, learning disabilities, cardiovascular issues, kidney problems, fertility issues, and more. On top of all of this, the Flint water crisis is an example of environmental injustice, seeing as it disproportionately affected predominantly African American communities as well as economically disadvantaged communities. Now, Flint was historically an industrial powerhouse during the early and mid 20th century. It was especially known for its strong automotive industry presence. In fact, General Motors was founded in Flint. However, by the late 20th century, Flint saw a decrease in manufacturing investment that was reflective of the deindustrialization of the U.S. as a whole. This led to a significant loss of available jobs in the city, which caused the population to drop from about 200,000 to around 100,000 people. The presence of many manufacturing plants had an effect on Flint's water resources. For decades, industries along the shores of the Flint River, which flows through the center of the city, disposed of refuse into the river. This obviously led to numerous contaminants being introduced into the waterway. In addition to the water contamination from industrial sources, the Flint River received contaminants from other sources as well, including raw sewage from the city's waste treatment plant, agricultural and urban runoff, and also leachate from nearby landfills. Due to all of these contaminants, the city of Flint chose to import treated drinking water from the city of Detroit, who used Lake Huron as their water source. Now, due to its decrease in population and economic activity, Flint was running a deficit from the late 20th century into the early 2000s. This caused Flint's mayor to appoint an emergency financial manager in 2011 who was tasked with cutting costs for the city. One of the plans the financial manager created was for Flint to create its own drinking water treatment system that used Lake Huron as a water source, rather than importing treated water directly from Detroit, which was very expensive. However, knowing the design and construction of such a system would take several years, the financial manager advocated the temporary use of Flint River water as a drinking water source. This temporary usage of low-quality Flint River water is ultimately the beginning of Flint's drinking water crisis. The chemistry behind how using Flint River water started the Flint water crisis stems from chemical reactions between contaminants from the Flint River and lead in Flint's water distribution system. The city of Flint's water distribution system at the time of the water crisis was reliant on lead pipes, which were commonly implemented in the early 20th century. When Flint River water was first used, chloride ions originating from runoff containing de-icing salts began corroding the lead. Additionally, the city of Flint did not use proper corrosion inhibitors, which caused the lead corrosion to be much more severe than necessary. In addition to high lead concentrations, Flint's drinking water also contained trihalomethanes after the switch to river water. These trihalomethanes were a chemical byproduct of an attempt to disinfect the river water, which had high levels of organic matter, with chlorine. These trihalomethanes are known carcinogens, adding further concern to an already dismal situation. Lastly, the switch to Flint River water caused an outbreak in Legionnaire's disease. Legionnaire's disease is a severe form of pneumonia, which is caused by an individual coming into contact with Legionella bacteria. Because so much of the disinfectant that Flint added to the river water ended up reacting with organic matter to create trihalomethanes, not enough was left over to kill all the disease pathogens, including the Legionella bacteria. As a result, 87 Flint citizens were diagnosed with Legionnaire's disease, with 12 of those 87 dying from it.
So, when we want to talk about the ethics surrounding this crisis, it's important to start with the harms that were caused to people. Um, so, the biggest, most sort of life-changing one is that around 100,000 people were exposed to greater than the safe amount of lead in their water, including 26,000 children. And that can cause a variety of issues in the short term and the long term. In the short term, if it's enough lead, it can cause lots of sort of acute symptoms and death. But even lower levels over the long term can cause lots of sort of learning disabilities and behavioral disorders. The most famous one sort of being that it can increase people's tendencies towards violence and antisocial behavior. It's also pretty well known that the effects on children and pregnant people are the most severe, and that even like short-term, like non-consecutive exposure can accumulate over time and get worse. Another issue was that there was just bacteria in the water, which caused Legionnaire's disease, which is a severe form of pneumonia that can kill people pretty fast. In terms of the real causes for this crisis, there are a couple main categories. The first one is largely economical. The city was paying a lot of money to Detroit in order to get their water from them. And they wanted to find a more like long-term feasible solution. The solution that they chose was to build a pipeline to a nearby city's water authority. And this decision is pretty much considered to be okay. But in the interim, while they were waiting for that new pipeline to be ready, they decided to use the Flint River, which was what caused all of the issues. The next thing was sort of once they had chosen to use the Flint River, they really employed a kind of wait and see what happens approach to testing the water. So the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality told Flint that they didn't necessarily need corrosion control to prevent lead seeping into the water, but they would wait and see what would be necessary after a certain amount of time. And then once the residents started to be concerned, there were reports that the local and state government sort of cherry picked which samples they would test when they did do testing so that they could just sort of eke in under the legal limits for lead in the water. And then overall, there's been a general effort to avoid accountability on the part of individuals and institutions, which has gotten in the way of fixing the issues. So all this kind of begs the question, who really made the poor decisions that caused this crisis? And the answer is pretty much uh, uh, the institutions, local, state, and even federal government that were meant to keep this community safe, really decided to not put clean water at the top of their list of priorities. All this has led lots of experts to say that Flint, Michigan is really one of the premier examples of environmental racism. The concerns of people of color over their health was just completely ignored, and despite a lot of attention, really continues to be.
As for the solutions for the Flint water crisis, there were some long-term and short-term solutions that were implemented for the affected area. The long-term solution was to replace all the lead piping within the city's infrastructure, and this would hopefully reduce the effects of lead being in the water and allow them to use the water system from the Flint plant. There were some short-term ones also to create some availability for fresh waters in the areas affected. This included bottled water as well as filters that were added to some lesser impacted areas. And there were also settlements for those that were affected, and these settlements often were in the shape of a class action or civil lawsuit. So, what did we learn from the Flint water crisis? Well, for one, you need to stay up to date with your infrastructure. This includes piping, sewage, whatnot. And this is important because if you don't stay up to date with that, with the new technology, eventually down the road, something will catch up to you. Also, you have to have safety and health of the public as your number one priority and understand that cutting costs may lead to cutting the health or safety of something. And this is important because the Flint government wanted to switch from Detroit to the Flint River as soon as it could, and this ultimately led to the wastewater treatment plant that was receiving the Flint water to not be up to date with everything, which allowed for lead to contaminate the fresh water. So what does this look like now? Well, in Flint, Michigan, over 95% of all lead pipes have been removed and replaced with new other metal pipes. And it is expected to be finished. At least all of the lead pipes will be removed and replaced by year's end. So by the end of 2023, everything should be replaced. Nationwide, only 10 states report lead pipe usage. So lead pipes aren't necessarily used throughout the whole nation, but there are lots of cities, lots of developed areas that still use this. And the Biden administration, just seeing the effects of lead piping in this one area, allocated 10 million over the next 2 years. I believe it was 15 million over the span of 3, but they have 5 million about per year to go towards replacing these infrastructures.
So in this portion of the presentation, we're going to talk about the risk analysis that kind of came with the Flint water crisis. Like there's the trade-off of risk versus rewards, what benefits the lawmakers had in making this decision and what drawbacks came with it, and what other companies can learn from the mistakes in order to like not have the same repercussions that Flint, Michigan faced during this national crisis. So first, we'll talk about what there is to gain from switching the water in Flint, Michigan. So the main driving factor for the Flint, Michigan municipal government to switch over to the Flint River was in order to save money. So there was an approximation made by some researchers that were working on this project that estimated to save about $5 million a year. and over the course of 25 years, they were expecting about $200 million worth of savings. And this was really important for Flint, Michigan at the time because they had just gone through a pretty big economic breakdown as the automotive industry, which used to be a major part of Flint, Michigan, was starting to leave and go to more international and less expensive countries for employment. So overall, Flint, Michigan had seen a pretty big decrease in their economic output, and therefore they needed to find ways to start saving money by cutting spending. So one reason they chose to switch over was to switch from buying money from Detroit to using their own water, but it was only supposed to be temporary. It was also meant to cope with a growing population. As you can see in the graph, there's a pretty stark trend in a decrease in population, but right before this Flint, Michigan crisis, they saw a little bit of an increase in population. So they anticipated having to spend more money on water, which is why savings became even more important. And the last reason is because there's already a lot of infrastructure in place. So switching over to the Flint, Michigan water, or to the Flint River water was relatively inexpensive. And it would have taken a lot more piping and like treatment facilities to get water from further away. So since the Flint River was like right there and they had pretty much the pipes necessary, even though they were bad quality, it would save money, save time, and be a pretty immediate response for this problem. And it was pretty much just intended as a temporary solution until they could find a more permanent solution. So the next question is, what is there to lose? So obviously we've learned from the rest of the presentation that there was a lot to lose in making this decision. The first is the cost. I mean, for a decision that was made in order to save money, it ended up costing a lot more money than they would have possibly saved. So an estimate came out to be $626 million to fix this Flint water crisis. So that's over $500 million, which is 3 times what they intended to save in 25 years. So not only do we see the loss of life in the cases of 12 people dying and the tens and hundreds of thousands of people affected by this, but there's a huge loss of money as well. So more onto that loss of life. Not only was there a loss of 12 lives that contracted a specific disease that came from the water, there was also death to plant life, death to animals and pets that had to drink this water, and wildlife that consumed this toxic water. And the last major drawback, which, while it might not seem as important to us, maybe this would influence lawmakers, is public image. So after this terrible crisis came about, the government of Flint, Michigan, and all the representatives were looked pretty down upon because of how poor of a decision this was. So for anybody who's trying to make a long-term career in maybe government work, probably wouldn't want to make this poor of a decision. So what's also important to note is that the entire population of Flint, Michigan is about 100,000 people, and nearly every single one of those 100,000 people were affected by this lead poisoning. So more into that is who suffered. So lots of people suffered in this, but it's also important to talk about who didn't suffer. And who didn't suffer was the people who had enough money to relocate, the people who had enough money to buy their own bottled water, people who maybe were more privileged and had their own like water filtration systems, but all those things cost money. So the people who didn't suffer were the people who had more money. So on the contrary, the people who suffered were the people who weren't as financially stable because they couldn't afford the luxuries of being able to just move or to get their own higher quality water sources. And I think that's important to know because a lot of these lawmakers weren't necessarily the ones suffering from the Flint water crisis and all the toxins in the water. So who did suffer? Well, that's the poor families. Flint, Michigan, like I said, has a population of 100,000 people, but 40%, actually a little over 40% of the population is impoverished. They don't meet, the economic requirements to be, considered, I guess, not in poverty. So these are a group of people who are already trying to make ends meet. They're trying their very hardest to provide for their families, raise their kids, give them the biggest shot in life that they can. And these are the ones who are going to be suffering and have to pay the medical bills and have to take their children out of school because they're sick. So it really is kind of a blow to people who can't take any more troubles in their life, which is really kind of sad to think about. Another thing to think about is Flint, Michigan is about more than 50%. It's about 56% African American, which may hint towards a bit of disconcern when it comes to the government officials making the decision on behalf of these populations. Maybe, I'm not going to go out there and say it's intentional, but it is disproportionately more African American than the rest of the country, and the fact that we're seeing it happen in the city might hint at some prejudice, some social injustice, which is definitely very, very bad. And then the other group of people who are very affected by this is children. So about 5%, I think the average in the city was about 3% of children, but in the most concentrated areas of the city, it's about 6% of children had alarming doses of lead in their blood. And this can cause numerous problems with their health and development, especially brain development. And so these are children who are trying to learn and are being inhibited by the fact that they have to drink this dirty water that's going to get them sick and cause, it's not deformations, but it's going to inhibit their growth mentally and physically. Not to mention that they have to go on regular hospital visits and doctor visits and get their blood drawn, which can all be pretty traumatic. And there's the vast majority of the population of the city was reported with having PTSD, which is unsurprising given the scale of this event. So overall, the people who suffered were those who were already suffering and they needed help rather than another form of another obstacle to hold them back. So what is there to learn for future companies that maybe face this dilemma of having expensive water versus switching to maybe less reliable water? The moral of the story is you should always put your citizens in your city first. Drinking water is like one of the most basic needs of any person. And by jeopardizing that, you not only jeopardize your public image and how you're going to be viewed in next elections or further advancements in your career, but you're also jeopardizing the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and stunting the growth of the next generation of Americans, which is one of the greatest crimes of all. So overall, companies that may face this dilemma should always err on the side of being overly cautious and maybe spending a little bit more money to make sure that their citizens can be healthy and lead-free. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and these are the sources, as you can see, and that'll be it. Thank you.